I quote, "Your survival is your goal. Your death is my privilege." End quote. Now this line, if you recognize it, then you, like me, got to see the greatest movie of all time and got to experience the greatest event of all time. This is the best movie ever made in history, and I'm including Endgame, No Way Home, all the Lord of the Rings, all the Star Wars, every single movie compared to this is nothing. And the reason why is because it's the reason we have the villains we have today. Now, what is this movie? The Return of Sherlock Holmes. It was made in 1929. It was the first sequel to the first Sherlock Holmes in 1916. However, it was also one of the first movies made with sound. And this is the reason why we have the greatest villains, because the quote that I just quoted came from Professor Moriarty. The reason we have the Joker, the reason we have Infinity War, Thanos, the reason why we have the best villains to date is because of this movie. And I cannot talk about the best villains and how to do them right without bringing this guy up at least once. And now that he's brought up, let's really kick off how to do a villain and how to do him right. Hello, my random viewers, and welcome to Randomly Offensive. Today we are talking about how to do villains right. This is a sequel to how to do OP characters right, and if you have not seen that, absolutely go and check it out. This is also a sequel to the Hype Zone, because this is going to explain how a villain can enter the Hype Zone. So, without further ado, real quick, I am going to pull only one villain from a certain genre or production. So for example, only one from Marvel, only one from the DCEU, only one from TV shows, and only one from anime. Because by pulling out only 4, not only do I cover everything across the board, but these 4 actually cover every way you can do a villain right, because there are 4 ways that you can pull it off successfully. Now, to kick off this list of villains done right is, of course, Mr. Snappity Snapman, the Mad Titan, Thanos himself. Because of course he was a villain done right. Of course he's gonna be on this list. And how did they do it? How did they do Thanos right? Well, they used 4 key aspects. They used 4 things to do this guy right. Number 1 is, of course, hype. They hyped this son of a bitch up. They hyped up this motherfucker. And how did they do that? Well, for one, they were throwing in subtle hints throughout the cinematic universe, throughout all the movies, getting us hyped for this big bad villain. And then, when we're finally introduced to him in Infinity War, he has already beaten Thor and all the Asgardians off screen. Now, normally this is a no-no when you take out an important character and important characters. It's on screen, but that's because people assume it's going to be a massive battle. This signaled to us that it wasn't even worth our time. Thanos was able to wipe them out so easily. There wasn't even a fight to watch. There was no point in even having an audience. And that point was pushed even further when they hyped us up during the Thanos versus Hulk scene. The Hulk destroyed the Hulk, Thanos destroyed the Hulk. He humiliated the Hulk. This hyped up the Mad Titan so freaking much, and we were so worried about our heroes. Now that was step 1, elevating this guy so freaking high. We were terrified of him, right? And now we are hyped. And Thanos is already on the verge of entering the hype zone, and he's only been on the screen for a few minutes at this point. And then the way he kills Loki. Not only is this guy incredibly strong, not only is this guy a combative genius and incredibly experienced, but this guy is ruthless. He does not freaking care if he kills you. He doesn't care how he does it. If he gets his hands around your throat, you're done, son! So, hype, number 1. Now, just building hype and having your character OP is not enough. It is never enough. And even if you enter the hype zone, it's still not enough because you still risk going into the anti-hype zone, and you don't want that to happen to your villain. So, how do you continue making a great villain if being hyped and having OP power levels is not enough? Well, you have to follow through with the hype. You have to give the audience a reason to feel like the hype was earned. You don't want them to think that the emotions you caused them to have was misplaced. You don't want that. What you want is them to walk out there going, oh my god, I was so freaking hyped for it, and it delivered on every freaking level. Now, how do you do that with a villain? Superheroes are different, main characters are different. How do you do that with a villain? Well, the easiest way and the number one way, the most preferred way, is to let the villain win at least once. If not consistently win, even if they lose at the end, right? You have got to give them a reason why the hype is earned, why this character deserves the hype that he's receiving. Now, they did that in Infinity War. They did allow Thanos to win in Infinity War, and he won so easily. Yeah, there was a couple complications, but for the most part, the Avengers didn't even stand a chance. The Mad Titan was a brick wall through the whole movie. There was no getting through this guy. He was going to crush you, and he was going to destroy you. He was a force to be reckoned with. Now, that is two ways that you can make your villain iconic. Hype them up and then follow through with the hype. Make damn sure the emotions you made your audience feel are earned. Number 3 is being able to understand the villain. Even if you don't agree with the villain, you gotta understand where he's coming from. You want to be able to understand what he's doing. And to even top it off, what they did with Thanos is they didn't only make you understand him, but they made you almost relate with him, as crazy as it is, but they still enforced you to disagree with him. Now, this guy's plan was absolutely horrible, and there's no way that you could morally justify what he was doing, which is what made him a villain. However, you definitely could understand where he was coming from and why he thought the way he thought, because when he told everyone to do what he wanted, they had the same reactions we would have, right? But then they died and the entire planet was destroyed. And then time after time after time after time again after that, he implemented his plan that everyone hated, and it worked over and over and over again. So you couldn't even argue with the guy because he was proven to be right consistently. And so though you morally couldn't agree with him, you also couldn't logically argue against it either. And yes, there are tons and tons of debates whether or not he could have just doubled the resources. However, if you actually do the math, that would not work. So logically arguing against this guy was near impossible, which made him incredibly understandable. You could understand where he was coming from, but at the same time, you couldn't relate with him because you're like, dude, like, I can relate with your feelings. I can relate with you being consistently right and not having any reason to think you're wrong, but I can't relate with you morally. You are a bad dude and you have to be stopped, and you are so dangerous because of how often you've been proven right, and you are so dangerous because you do feel like you are God tier level decision maker, but you're not. You have to be stopped. And so that's perfect. Creating understanding but conflict at the same time, that is a great way to make an iconic villain. Now, number 4 is more of what not to do, because they did screw up with Thanos a little bit. He's still iconic and he's still a great villain, but they screwed up in Endgame. They threw away everything good about Thanos and just turned him into a dark side character. They just turned him into a bad to be bad, an evil to be evil Thanos. All the character development, all the character building for Thanos was just thrown out the window, and they made him a just basic, normal bad guy with no depth to him, with no meat behind his bones. And that is one of the things you don't want to do, because that actually did cause a lot of people to dislike Endgame, or at least not like Endgame as much as Infinity War, which should not have happened. Everyone should have preferred Endgame over Infinity War, and the reason why is because it's just the amount of hype that it had. And it was supposed to be the superior, it was advertised as the superior to Infinity War. So that's the number one thing you do. Once you've built everything, once you have the foundation, don't break it just because you want to tell the story and the story doesn't allow for this well developed of a villain. If you have this well of a developed villain, don't throw him away because you need a story. Just use a different villain. Do not sacrifice the villain you made to tell your story. So, Marvel's done. That is one way to make a good villain. Now, the next example of a great villain done right this guy's been done so freaking much, and it's so overdone that I almost don't want to do him, but I have to because he's just a great example. But he's been overdone in media. He's been covered a million times on YouTube, and this is not a fresh take at all, so I apologize. I'll make it as fresh as I can. However, the next dude that's a great example is the Joker. Of course it's the Joker from the DCEU. It's gotta be, right? So, he has only 2 examples and 2 reasons why he is the number 1 villain in the DCEU and why he is so incredibly iconic. Alrighty, so the Joker, incredibly iconic. Well, why? The 2 reasons why is because number 1, they use the embodiment of fear. This is incredibly simple sounding, but it is a lot harder than you'd think. Using a human embodiment of someone's natural fear, of the majority's natural fear, can often backfire because you tend to humanize that said character, even though he is an embodiment of a fear, which means a lot of times they're going to contradict that embodied fear. They are going to contradict the fear that they are embodying with this character, and by doing that, they're going to equal out and zero out the effectiveness of said character. With the Joker, however, they don't try to go with the trope of making the villain understandable because the embodiment that they are doing is the fear of unpredictability, the fear of lack of understanding. And so you can't have a villain that you can understand but also be the embodiment of unpredictability. It doesn't work. And so they created the embodiment of fear through the Joker, and they were exposing our fear of unpredictability and lack of understanding something to create the foundation of the greatest villain we've ever seen with face paint. So, that's step number 1. Now, step number 2 with the Joker is consistency. They showed that his strength was being a genius. That is his strength, is being genius. Now, you cannot have a genius villain and then later on be beaten by being outsmarted by the hero, and what outsmarted him was something that was so incredibly stupid we can't even believe that the villain would fall for it, right? So you have got to be consistent. If he is a super genius and that's his strength, then that has to be his strength every freaking time, and it has to be stronger than everyone else's. So that is how you create a good hero. If he is strong, if he's incredibly intelligent, if he's a trickster, it doesn't matter. You have to be consistent with the element that you have given your villain. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the face-painted Joker laughing clown villain because it's been done so much, but those are the 2 key reasons: embodiment of fear and consistency. Now, before I go on to my 3rd example, I do want to explain one thing. The best way to make a strong, iconic, great villain is not always having to make them relatable. Not every single one of these steps are founded in ground, right? You can come up with your own way to do it, and it can be done very well. But the most preferred way for most people, and the easiest way if you are a beginner, which I am, and this is why I'm doing these YouTube channels, because explaining things is a great way to learn things, right? And so the best way to introduce your villain and make them iconic is, instead of doing what you would do with a superhero, where you build a character arc and have the audience watch his life through his eyes, the villain, oftentimes you want to introduce them at the end of their arc. So you introduce the superhero at the beginning of their arc, you introduce the villain at the end of their arc, and that way you have this opposite clashing battle, right? The villain is always going to be either more intelligent or more experienced or stronger than the hero, because they're at the end of their story arc, and they already have mystery and depth behind them because they've already been through it all. They've already seen it all. And that is the easiest way to make a good villain. And the reason I bring it up is because that is exactly what we get in Blacklist with the kind of hero slash main character slash villain, Raymond Reddington. Raymond Reddington is a perfect example of how to make an iconic villain and how to do a villain right. However, they don't use the methods for the Joker, and they do not use the methods for Thanos. They use something completely different. They use the value of trust, and then that value of trust being broken time and time again. And they also use the depth of an already experienced character. They use the depth of a character whose story arc has already been told. You're at the end of his story, and you are watching the end of his life. You are watching the end of his career. Why does this work? Well, for one, it establishes that he is already the most powerful person on screen, whether that's physically or financially or what have you, right? And normally you want to see this stuff on screen, but when you're talking about a villain, when you're talking about a bad guy, it's always more effective to do it off screen. And the reason why is because by creating untold stories, you are creating depth to the character along with mystery. The mystery can then be told after you unravel the character, understanding the character more and more and more and more and more. Because when you first meet the character, you don't actually know much about him because he is a shell of his former self. And when you see more and more and more of the character, the shell of his former self is starting to come out even a little bit more and more and more and more, creating the character to be more relatable than he ever was before, while adapting the fear that you already had for him in a new light, because now you understand why he is the way he is. And that's creating an emotional connection to the villain that you have already established to be an incredible threat. Does that make sense? Another big key factor that a lot of people misconstrue is that your character has to be relatable. You have to be able to relate with the villain. That's not always true. That is not always the case. Granted, you want to be able to understand the hero, or the villain, and you also want to be able to somewhat relate, but you don't always have to, and you cannot relate with Raymond Reddington. You cannot relate with the fact that, for one, he's consistently breaking trust that he's building with the audience. He'll build trust with the audience, and then he'll break it with the audience. He'll build trust with the audience, and he'll break it with the audience. Consistently lying, and the audience buys into these lies, and then when we realize that it was a lie, we actually feel like he betrayed us, the audience. And so you can't relate with someone that you can't trust. It is not possible. Also, you cannot relate with the pure depth of evil and the pure depth of the things that he's willing to do. You cannot relate with that kind of man. He is a bad, bad man. But the reason why you love him is because he's enjoyable to watch. And the reason we can connect with the show is because he is an example of what you do not want to be. He shows us why we must work on ourselves, why we must always do better for ourselves, why we should never be proud of the negative parts of ourselves, because that pride in the wrong things can turn us into a human form monster. We do not want to be a monster in the skin or the shell of a human. We want to be human. That is the only way to be. And Raymond Reddington shows us an example of what we could be if we did not work on ourselves. And that's what makes Raymond Reddington such an amazing freaking villain to watch. Now, the final example, the example of a villain I'm going to use from an anime, a lesser known anime, if I do say so myself, is Black Cat. Now, this villain is Creed Diskins, and he is the hardest version of doing a character right. He is the hardest. This is the hardest way to make a villain right, and that is making the villain the underdog, making the villain lesser than the hero. And how do you do that properly? It's incredibly hard to do. I will not attempt this for at least 5 or 6 more years because this is not an easy thing to do. This is probably the hardest way to make a villain right. Making a villain an underdog takes such a fine finesse and so much detail, and you have to go all the way. And that is easier said than done. How they pull it off with Creed Diskins is they make it very well known from the beginning that he does not stand a chance physically against Train Hartnett. They make it incredibly obvious from the beginning that he is no mental or psychological threat to Sven Volsfeed, and they make it so that he is no biological threat to Eve. So, why is he a threatening character? Well, because time and time again, he loses to the main characters while still winning. No matter what this guy is put through, no matter what this guy goes through from our main protagonist, this guy manages to get back up. He manages to outsmart Train when he can. He manages to outstrength Sven when he can. And he manages to outstrength and outsmart the biological superior of Eve, even though the odds are stacked against him in every single way. This guy is obsessed with Train Hartnett. Now that is one of the driving factors of this guy. That's what makes him being an underdog not a big deal in our eyes, because he idolizes the main protagonist. He idolizes the character. He wants this character to be a part of his team. And everything he does is to impress the protagonist. He is a fanboy, and he is psychotic. He has no reasoning besides his pure passion and love for the protagonist, and you can't help but feel for the guy, but be scared of him at the same time. How can you be scared of an underdog? Well, the same reason you are intimidated by Rocky, right? No matter how often he is pounded down to the ground, he gets back up and he starts swinging again. And Creed Diskins is the embodiment of perseverance, right? He is the embodiment of everything we want to be while being the guy that you don't want to be. And this combination shouldn't work, but they play it in such a way where it does, because he has friends that will back him up just like a protagonist. He has the drive to succeed just like the protagonist. Now, whether or not he's right or not is never an issue. They try to bring that up and he's like, you know what? I don't fucking care. I'm going to stab you in the heart now because you're annoying me. And that kind of combination of underdog with just pure evil is such a hard thing to master, and they do it so well. So if you are a crazy if you are a crazy bastard, go for it. Fucking try this. And if you are super crazy, try it on your first shot. Whatever. It might work. Who knows? Just do what you love. But it is incredibly difficult to make an underdog villain iconic. It is incredibly hard. And so many people have missed out on the character of Creed Diskins because they don't see the brilliant excellence that he brings to the table as a villain. This guy is incredible. So, with that being said, that is all I have to say for today. If you made it this far, thank you so much, and please do remember to like, subscribe, and share. It helps me out a lot on my small frickin' channel. I would love to do this part-time. Right now I'm doing it for non-profit, but I would love to do this part-time. I'd love to put more time towards my Poke the Wokes over at Rumble. I would love to put more time towards my YouTube videos. My goal is to do 14 videos a week. Right now I'm having to strike back down and go down to 6 videos a week because I have to take Sundays off at this point just so I can keep delivering you guys content. So, with that being said, again, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't seen my other videos and some of my terminology is confusing you, I will leave a link to them at the end of this video. Definitely go check them out. And yeah, take care of yourselves and don't get hit by a meteor. Bye.